Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey Herman and Corn. So a friend had a birthday party last night in Jerusalem, and the venue for the bar was right next to the U.S. Embassy building on Agron Street in Jerusalem. And my wife and I were having a debate as to whether this was still a functioning diplomatic mission, because there's still this really intense. It's been a feature of life in Jerusalem on that street for some time. It's a pretty small property, but they have this really intense security going on, which I guess is a bit unusual for a diplomatic mission, in that there's no kind of like buffer or perimeter. There's just a sidewalk, and they have these, the crazy arrays of CCTV cameras and a whole bunch of people just kind of scanning all around. It's pretty intense. I recall that this was like a Palestinian affairs unit, and that the Biden and Trump administrations had a kind of tug of war over what was going to be of this mission. So I'd love to get into the US topic of the American diplomatic footprint in Israel for quite some time now, at the moment, because they have this situation. The US Embassy was previously in Tel Aviv, and they've now called this a branch office. With the embassy itself in East Jerusalem, I think is technically correct. It's over the Green Line, but in Jerusalem. Then you've got this property that was formerly a liaison to the Palestinians. And my question, Herman and Corn, is this situation by which that the US has created, in which there is what's called branch office of the embassy in Tel Aviv. It seems quite unique. Is that a standard arrangement that you have a diplomatic mission split between two cities? And then you've got the commercial unit. They have a building as well. So it's interesting. We've talked about diplomacy and diplomatic missions quite a bit on this podcast. And the US, I think, is an example of a whole array of units and buildings working together to further US interests in Israel. Herman and Corn, let's talk today about how embassies operate within a broader network sometimes, and particularly significant bilateral relationships in which you have different offices all working together. What are some other examples beside the US-Israel relationship of this? And how do they all communicate and make sure that they're staying on the same page in representing their country?
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn, and I am joined as always by my brother, Herman Poppleberry.
Good to be here, Corn. We have got a really interesting one today that actually hits quite close to home for us.
It really does. Our housemate Daniel sent us a voice note after he was out for a friend's birthday party last night. The venue was right near Agron Street in central Jerusalem, and he and his wife ended up in this big debate about the building there with all the security. It is the United States diplomatic facility on Agron, and Daniel was asking about how that whole footprint works.
It is a classic Jerusalem conversation topic. You see the massive security presence, the cameras, the barriers, and you start wondering what is actually happening behind those walls. Especially since the U.S. moved its embassy to the Arnona neighborhood in 2018.
Exactly. Daniel's question was really about the split nature of it all. You have the main embassy in Jerusalem, this significant office on Agron Street, and then still a major presence down in Tel Aviv on Hayakon Street. He wanted to know if this kind of split arrangement is standard for a diplomatic mission, or if we are looking at something unique here.
It is actually a fascinating case study in how diplomacy adapts to geography and politics. Most people think of an embassy as one single building in a capital city where everyone works together, but the reality for major powers like the United States is often a lot more fragmented.
Right, and I think to understand why the US footprint in Israel looks the way it does, we have to look at the history of that building on Agron Street. Because for a long time, it was not actually part of an embassy, right?
Exactly. For decades, that building was the U.S. Consulate General in Jerusalem, and what made it unique was that it did not report to the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv. It reported directly to the State Department in Washington. It had its own independent relationship with the local population and the Palestinian Authority.
That is such a rare setup. Usually, a consulate is a subordinate office to the embassy, but in this case, you basically had two parallel tracks of American diplomacy happening in the same small geographic area.
It was incredibly unusual. When the U.S. officially recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moved the embassy there in 2018, that independent status changed. The consulate was merged into the embassy structure. But the physical footprint stayed. That building on Agron is still vital because the new embassy site in Arnona, while it is the official seat of the ambassador, simply is not big enough to hold every single department.
This is where we get into the logistics of the split. You have the ambassador and the core diplomatic team out in Arnona, which is in the southeastern part of the city. Then you have the consular section and other units still operating out of Agron Street in the center of town. And then, as Daniel pointed out, there is still the Tel Aviv office.
Right. The Tel Aviv facility is now officially called the Embassy Branch Office. It is still a massive operation. Think about it. For decades, the entire mission was centered there on the coast. You have specialized teams for trade, security cooperation, and massive administrative departments that you cannot just pick up and move overnight.
Is that the main reason for the split? Just a lack of space?
Space is a huge part of it, but it is also about continuity. If you have 1,000 people working in Tel Aviv and your new site in Jerusalem only has space for a few hundred, you have to maintain both. But there is also a political and security layer. Having offices in different locations provides a certain level of redundancy and allows the mission to maintain a physical presence near different centers of influence.
Daniel asked if this is a standard arrangement. When I think of other countries, I usually imagine a big compound in the capital. Are there other examples of missions being split across multiple cities or locations like this?
There are actually several prominent examples, though the reasons vary. One of the most famous is South Africa. Because South Africa has 3 different capital cities, Pretoria as the administrative capital, Cape Town as the legislative capital, and Bloemfontein as the judicial capital, most foreign missions have to maintain a split presence.
I remember reading about that. Most embassies are in Pretoria, but when Parliament is in session, the entire diplomatic corps basically decamps to Cape Town for months at a time.
Exactly. Many countries actually own 2 residences for their ambassadors and 2 sets of offices just to handle that seasonal move. It is a massive logistical headache. Then you have the case of Germany, which provides a really interesting historical parallel to what we see here.
You mean the move from Bonn to Berlin after reunification?
Precisely. After the capital moved back to Berlin in the 1990s, many countries kept a significant presence in Bonn for years. The U.S., for example, maintained a huge office in Bonn while the main embassy was being established in Berlin. It was a multi-year transition where functions were slowly migrated.
That makes sense. It is almost like a slow-motion move. But what about countries where the capital is officially one place, but the business or population center is another?
Australia is a great example of that. The capital is Canberra, and that is where the embassies are. But Canberra is a relatively small city. So, for the United States or the United Kingdom, the diplomatic footprint in Sydney or Melbourne is often just as large, if not larger, than the actual embassy in Canberra. Those offices handle the bulk of the commercial, cultural, and consular work because that is where the people and the businesses are.
So in that sense, the Tel Aviv Branch Office is a bit like the Sydney Consulate for the US mission in Australia. It is where the economic heart of the country beats.
That is a perfect way to look at it. Tel Aviv is the tech hub, the financial center, and the main point of entry for many Americans. You cannot effectively represent U.S. interests in Israel without a major permanent presence in Tel Aviv, regardless of where the official embassy building sits.
One thing that fascinates me is the coordination side of this. Daniel's prompt touched on how these various units stay on the same page. If you have teams in 3 different locations, all representing the same country. How do they ensure they are not sending mixed signals?
That is the million-dollar question in diplomacy. It all comes down to a principle called Chief of Mission Authority. Every single U.S. government employee in a country, regardless of which agency they work for, reports to the ambassador. The ambassador is the personal representative of the president and has the final word on all policy and messaging.
So even if you are an agricultural attaché working in a branch office in Tel Aviv, your ultimate boss in country is the ambassador in Jerusalem.
Correct. And to make that work, they rely on a very structured system of communication. There are daily country team meetings, which these days are often done via secure video conferencing. The heads of every section, no matter where they are physically located, get on a call to brief the ambassador and coordinate their activities for the day.
I imagine the technical requirements for that are pretty intense. You were talking about highly classified information being shared between different buildings across different cities.
Oh, it is incredibly sophisticated. Every major U.S. diplomatic facility has what is called a SCIF, which stands for Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. These are rooms that are hardened against electronic eavesdropping and physical intrusion. When the team in Jerusalem needs to talk to the team in Tel Aviv about something sensitive, they go into these rooms. The data is encrypted using military-grade protocols and sent over dedicated fiber lines.
It is like having a private, secure internet just for the embassy.
Essentially, yes. But beyond the tech, there is a lot of physical movement. Diplomats in Israel spend a lot of time on the highway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. It is not uncommon for a senior official to have a morning meeting at a ministry in Jerusalem and then head down to Tel Aviv for a commercial event in the afternoon.
You mentioned earlier that the Agron Street office has a specific role now. We should clarify that, because it has been a point of some confusion in the news lately.
Right. The office on Agron Street continues to serve important consular and diplomatic functions as part of the embassy structure. It maintains a dedicated presence in the center of the city, which is more accessible for many of their contacts.
And that is distinct from the core embassy functions in Arnona.
Yes, though they all report to the same ambassador. The goal is to ensure there is a dedicated team focused on those specific issues, using that historic location in the center of the city.
It is interesting how these buildings take on a life of their own. The history of the building itself dictates how people perceive the diplomacy happening inside.
It really does. Diplomacy is as much about presence and perception as it is about policy. Where you choose to put your office tells the host country and the world what you value.
That brings up an interesting point about the U.S. Consulate General in Frankfurt. We've talked about this before, but it is a great example of a diplomatic post that is massive but is not an embassy.
Exactly. The Frankfurt Consulate is actually one of the largest U.S. diplomatic posts in the world, but its primary job is not just representing the U.S. in that part of Germany. It houses the Regional Support Center.
I remember you explaining this. It basically acts as a massive hub for the entire region, right?
Yes. It provides logistics, procurement, and IT support to over 100 other U.S. missions across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. So, while it is technically a consulate, its operational footprint is global. It is a reminder that the size or location of a building does not always tell the whole story of what is happening inside.
It is like the back-end server for American diplomacy in half the world.
That is exactly what it is. And that brings us back to Daniel's observation about the security at Agron Street. When you see that level of protection, it is not just because of the importance of the work being done there today. It is also because those buildings are icons. They represent the state they belong to, and that makes them targets.
The security footprint Daniel saw, the cameras and the barriers, that is the physical manifestation of the political weight that building carries.
Precisely. And in a city like Jerusalem, where every square inch is contested or has deep historical meaning, that weight is amplified. The split footprint is a way of managing that weight while still getting the job done.
You know, we have covered a lot of these diplomatic nuances over the years. I think we have done over 470 episodes now, and we keep coming back to how these international relationships are actually managed on the ground.
It is because the how is often just as important as the what. You can have a great policy, but if you do not have the right people in the right buildings with the right secure lines, you cannot execute it.
So, to answer Daniel's question, the split is not necessarily the standard for every country, but for a major power in a complex environment, it is actually quite common. Whether it is for space, logistics, or political continuity, having a network of offices is often the only way to function effectively.
And the coordination part is really the secret sauce. It is about that clear chain of command under the ambassador and the massive technological investment that allows people in different cities to work as if they are in the same room.
It is a bit like our podcast in a way. We have our different perspectives and we are looking at things from different angles, but we are always working toward that same goal of understanding the topic.
I like that analogy, though I think our security footprint is a little smaller than the embassy's.
Just a little, but hey, we have our own version of a secure line right here.
True enough. I think one of the big takeaways for me, looking at this whole situation, is that diplomacy is incredibly resilient. It finds a way to work around these geographical splits and political hurdles.
It has to. The world does not stop moving just because your office is in two different places. If anything, the split footprint forces you to be more intentional about your communication. You cannot just rely on bumping into someone in the hallway.
That is a great point. It requires a level of disciplined coordination that a single-site mission might actually lack. When you know you are split, you build the systems to bridge that gap.
I wonder what the future of this looks like. As we move more toward remote work and digital diplomacy, will these massive physical footprints become less important?
I think it is the opposite, actually. The more digital the world becomes, the more valuable that face-to-face physical presence becomes. You can do a video call for a routine briefing, but for the real work of building trust and negotiating sensitive issues, you need to be in the room, and you need that room to be secure and recognizable.
That makes sense. The building itself is a promise of commitment.
Exactly. It says, we are here, we are staying, and we are invested in this relationship, whether it is in Arnona, on Agron Street, or down in Tel Aviv.
Well, I think we have given Daniel plenty of fuel for his next debate. It is not just a weird quirk of Jerusalem. It is a sophisticated, multi-layered response to a very unique set of challenges.
It really is. And it is a reminder that there is always a deeper story behind the security cameras and the concrete barriers.
For sure. Well, I think that is a good place to wrap this one up. If you've been enjoying the show, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a quick review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find us and keeps the conversation going.
It really does. We love hearing from you all.
You can find all of our past episodes and more information at our website, myweirdprompts.com. We are also on Spotify, so make sure to follow us there.
Thanks to Daniel for sending in such a great prompt. It is always fun to dig into the things we see every day, but don't always fully understand.
Absolutely. This has been My Weird Prompts. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you next time.
See you then.
So, as we were saying about the coordination, I actually read something interesting about how they handle the physical mail between the two sites.
Oh, the diplomatic pouch?
Yeah, they have these dedicated couriers who move back and forth multiple times a day. It is not just digital. There is a whole physical logistics chain that never stops.
It is a massive operation. People often forget about the hundreds of support staff, the drivers, the technicians, the administrative officers who make all of this possible. The diplomats are just the tip of the iceberg.
It really is a small city unto itself.
A split city for a split mission.
Exactly. All right, let's head out. I think I'm actually meeting someone near Agron Street later today. I'll have to take a closer look at those cameras now that we've talked about them.
Just don't look too closely, Corn. They might start wondering what you're up to.
Fair point. I'll keep a respectful distance.
Good call. Talk to you later.
Catch you later, Herman.
And thanks again to everyone for tuning in. We really value this community.
We definitely do. See you in the next one.
Goodbye for now.
Bye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.